Wherever you are in the world, welcome to another edition of Jerry's Take on China. We're all buying into the myth of a trade war with China, or that China is isolated from the global community. But it isn't true. No matter what the headlines say, the truth is very different. First of all, to see how serious this problem might be, we need to separate the few countries that reportedly have problems with China from the many countries which don't. Much of what we know as the international community do have problems with China. They believe China is a threat to them, and they believe they need to de-risk. But despite these tensions, robust trade continues. Actual membership of this international community remains nebulous, but according to some academics, it consists of as few as 10 countries, led by the USA, but includes some EU countries, not all of them, Australia, the UK, Canada, and perhaps, but to a lesser extent, Japan and South Korea. These countries, all aligned with the USA, do seem to have a problem with China. However, there appear to be no Middle Eastern, no Eurasian, no African, and no Latin Americans in this international community. No Muslim country claims membership either. As far as Asia is concerned, there may be more, but the two previously mentioned are bristling with US bases, and both Japan and South Korea have large portions of their communities who don't want this situation to continue. Countries not forming part of the international community don't seem to have a problem with China. There are 195 countries in the world, and 147 of them have signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative. Furthermore, dozens of them have indicated a desire to join BRICS. They don't see a threat from China. They see opportunities with China. The USA has sanctioned and banned some products to or from China, and their international community generally has followed suit. China, on the other hand, has not. That's correct. China has not banned the export or importation of any products. It has referred some to the World Trade Organization. It has placed restrictions on some, and we'll get to that in a moment, but it hasn't banned anything other than Australian lobsters and Australian wood, reasoning that they were both contaminated. Both problems are now addressed, and both should resume trading soon. A few people will challenge this. They'll challenge it because it's been reported that China has banned gallium and germanium, but they haven't. They've restricted them to sale under license, and that's very different. Unlike the USA, which did ban the sale of certain chips and the machinery to make them, China has not prohibited the sale of these two minerals used to make them. If the USA or anyone else wants to buy gallium or germanium to make products for peaceful purposes, they can do so under license with end-user certificates. If they want them to make bombs, military hardware, or other implements that might be used to kill, then they can't. And that is what de-risking ought to mean. On the topic of threats, while we could argue that a 3-week incursion into Vietnam in 1979 was an exception, China has never invaded, occupied, or colonized any country anywhere in its history, whereas the international community broadly consists of invading, occupying, and colonizing or colonized countries. If we look closely at the countries claiming China as a threat to their national security, their freedoms, or their democracy, we'd expect to find declining trade figures. And if we just read media reports, that's what we do see. However, if we look beyond the headlines and see the real trade figures, the opposite is true. It seems we're being conned. Many countries feel some perceived threat from China, but Australia holds a special place in this trade war narrative. And despite this, China is, by a huge margin, Australia's largest trading partner. China did prevent the importation of some coal, but it's now a matter of public record, having been tabled in Parliament, that the Australian coal industry was lying about the quality of their exports. China picked them up on it and it stopped them. It's also worth noting that literally days after China temporarily stopped importing Australian coal, USA increased their coal sales to China by 900%. It's also true that when China placed tariffs on Australian wine and restricted the import of Australian lobsters, the slack was immediately taken up on each of those products by Australia's closest ally, the USA. For the record, full Australian coal exports to China restarted many months ago in February 2023. Australian media tells us that China is buying up all the farmland, but it isn't. Closer examination indicates purchases of Chinese farmland went from 1.7 to 2.4%, and that included Hong Kong's ownership of the foreign-owned land. Even that has now declined to virtually none. Note that 2.4% was China's share of foreign-owned land, not China's share of Australia. The Netherlands, USA and UK all own a lot more. Then the narrative switched to Chinese are buying up all the houses, but they aren't. Foreign investors from all overseas countries combined were buying a total of 3.7% of the new homes and 2.2% of existing homes in Australia. Again, we're being conned. And what's worse, we're being conned by sensationalism, perhaps even racism, but certainly not the reality. Nevertheless, the Australian government has now written new laws preventing foreign ownership of homes in Australia. China and Australia are currently trading at record highs, with March 2023 being the best month ever. There have been some product changes in recent years. For example, China no longer buys as much Australian wine, while the US wine sales to China increased by 120%. And as for lobsters, the US state of Maine would like to thank Australia for their contribution to an industry that was decimated by Trump's restrictions, but has now recovered and surged to record highs through Australia's woes. Australians are being conned. China is not their enemy. In 2023, trade between China and the EU hit record highs in the first quarter. The BBC in February 23 reported that despite there being a 5-year trade war between the USA and China, the 2022 trade figures between these two countries were at another record high. Furthermore, direct foreign investment into China saw its largest single quarter in the first quarter of 2023 and is tracking at a 12% growth on 2022's previous record year. This is a most interesting trade war, one in which all the numbers indicate growth. We're witnessing one of the biggest myths in history. British, Australian, European, and American media will all have us believe that China is a threat and de-risking or decoupling is needed. And the reality is that despite political claims and media amplifications of them, business people know China may hold challenges, but it's their greatest opportunity for growth and investments. China is not a threat. It never has been. The real threat is people telling us that China is a threat, and we should ask them why they are doing that. And what is it that really frightens them? The facts, if we take time to view them, tell us clearly it is not China. Thanks once again for watching Jerry's Take on China, and please don't forget to share these videos if you haven't already. Liking them on YouTube increases the number of views they get, so please do that too. And if you haven't already subscribed, now is a great time to do so. Thanks very much. See you next time.